Welcome back. I believe you owe us an answer.
No,
Or a response, okay.
No, I'm very keen to give an input here,
yes.
because I think the fact that things went wrong with the Nkandla report, I mean, everyone is very, very clear about that. And I mean, that was demonstrated already weeks ago by government's own report. Well, it was demonstrated even before that. I mean, by the release of government's report, it became very, very clear that there were serious things that went wrong with the management of that project. What I think, in addition to the problems within the public sector that are demonstrated by that, I think it also starts pointing to a serious problem of private sector corruption. Because in each of those cases you have massive escalation of prices by private contractors who are doing business with the state.
Well, they were chosen by the president.
We are sitting with a construction industry that is colluded and that has ripped the state and by extension and by extension the people of South Africa off of billions and billions of rand. And we are saying that we need to put mechanisms in place to tackle private sector corruption as hard as we are busy tackling public sector corruption.
I noted that you nodded when Mr. Nel spoke about private sector corruption.
No, there's no leadership on both sides. If you look at the public sector and the private sector, what's happening, what happened in Nkandla, I think what seems to be the problem here as well is that there will be no consequences for the people. It's very unlikely that anyone is going to be punished for what happened in the Nkandla Gate scandal. Or what's going to happen is that you're going to find a situation where a junior official actually takes the fall for what happened.
I'll come back to that, but I also want to ask you this.
I would beg to differ.
Well, I'm going to come to you now. I just want to ask you this, though.
Yes.
You also said there's no leadership in the private sector. I just want to probe that for a moment. What do you mean?
No, if you look at incidents of price fixing and collusion that happened in the private sector.
Shocking, cartel behavior, yes.
It was very clear that there's also poor leadership in the private sector.
How would you change that?
I think it's more a question of trying to make sure that both the private and public sector work together, they create partnerships and talk about the kind of society that we want to build and how we can promote a culture of good governance and a corruption-free society. Because those are things that we need to do as a society in order to try to get out of the situation that we find ourselves in.
So could I just ask this point? I know you want to respond to something later in Nkandla, but I also want to ask you this. Because you want to respond to the point being made that only junior officials will get into. Do you accept that there's a huge responsibility here on government to actually make sure that whoever is responsible for this really comes to book? And it doesn't matter who they are, from the highest to the lowest.
No, absolutely.
And will that happen? I mean, people...
No, that is already starting to happen. President Zuma has already issued a proclamation requesting the SIU to investigate this matter. So it's an investigation.
Will that include investigation of him?
It's an investigation of the
whole
process. And I think
I'm giving you a chance. Let me finish.
That proclamation on Nkandla, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, would be probably the 41st proclamation that President Zuma has signed since he became president in 2009. That is more proclamations sending the SIU in to investigate corruption.
We can do that in two ways. That there's so much now that you've got to do this.
But the fact of the matter is that the president is sending the SIU into those situations to investigate more than any president in democratic South Africa has ever done.
Maimane? I mean, I think without fail, what we must concede here is that we don't even have to investigate that. What is factually true is that 240 million rands of taxpayers' money was spent servicing a private residence house at the expense of other projects. Now, that's a function of leadership. That means President Zuma didn't come home and get surprised that his house was suddenly being built at some astronomical costs. He was clearly, as the process grew and scope creep, becoming aware of that. And my question is, why was there not that leadership to say at that point, pause the bus, you cannot have this project continue at this level, can we fund it anywhere else?
On a legal basis, how do you respond to Mr. Nel's point that there's now a proclamation that it's going to be investigated?
I would hope that that investigation extends further and includes the president himself in the whole project. Because here...
I didn't take him to say it wasn't going to be.
You see, what has happened is that, as you've seen with the SIE report, that it's focused on particular departments, and it's focused. My question here, as a South African voter, is that accepting that there's legislation and proclamations where the SIU gets sent in. Gupta Gate was a prime example of the same process. My fundamental issue here is, where is the leadership, both in the public and the private sector, that stands up and says, I will indeed, when there's corruption taking place, be willing to resign and be an integrous South African who accepts the fact that I'm accountable to the people?
Would you do that if you were the Gauteng Premier and there was, and there's, I know Mr.
If
Nel
I was
saying
found.
that's not going to happen, but assuming that you were, well, assuming it's not you, but your officials do it and you say, it was on my watch, I'll go.
I think
Would
if I become knowingly aware of a project, and if I fail to act, then I've failed the people of this country, and I must step down.
Do you think across the board, I want to ask you this, let me put this to you, put to all three of you. People say, you can listen to programs, you can listen to people say, why should we pay tax when so much money is being stolen? It's a serious problem now. Lots of people say, well, we would be prepared to pay more tax if we knew it wasn't going to be stolen. How does the political process kind of make sure that this stuff doesn't happen across the board?
Political accountability starts in many ways at the ballot box. When people look at those lists, that's why we make our lists public and we give the public enough time to look so that you can scrutinize. And that's why when we've asked for electoral reform to say that it must be constituency-based, we want it for that precise reason, so that you can say, I live in this community in Soweto. I elected Mr. So-and-so. Mr. So-and-so needs to represent my issues well. Otherwise, I will vote that person out. That is a form of accountability that politicians fear. The problem is now...
But we haven't reached that level. I mean, your voters will vote for you, come what may. His voters vote for the come what may.
I think we're getting to a stage even here in Gauteng where political change is bound to happen.
All right.
The fundamental issue here is that when political parties don't believe that they must fear the public, they believe that they'll rule until Jesus comes back, well then, it gives license to never be accountable to the voters, which invents a secondary problem. That's why when you talk about service delivery, even protests that are taking place, it's primarily because politicians don't bother to respond to people.
What I'm pressing you on,
yes.
Give me one thing that you would do if you were the Gauteng Premier tomorrow, which would alter the trajectory of corruption. Just one thing. What would you do?
Open the tender adjudication committees. Make sure they become public and anyone can know exactly what is happening there.
All right. But now I want to just ask you one thing.
Yes, we've also been saying, in fact, since 2009, that we need to centralize the tender system so that there can be transparency and full control over it.
It's fantastic.
But the other very important thing, centralization is very key, because decentralization hasn't worked. And I think the other problem is that if you make it transparent so that people can understand the process and they can understand exactly as to how a certain individual actually got a certain tender, then it makes it easy, it makes it a fair process, and there's enough transparency in it.
Thank you very much. I've run out of time, which is a great pity, because I think this program should go on for a couple of hours, and the reason for that is there can be no more important issue. I mean, if we don't have integrity and accountability and transparency in government, we're in terrible trouble. And what we've been trying to interrogate this evening is not one or other issue. It's how do we go forward. The Public Protector herself said in a report, I'm worried about the future. The real question we've got to worry about is what do we build in as mechanisms to ensure that those fundamental principles are central to democratic government in South Africa going forward. You've heard proposals from all three parties. How do you assess them? Judge for yourself. Goodbye.